and you will find Bukhari himself includes many contradictory reports, even on issues like the age of Khadija. That it is not a coincidence that Allah left many historical questions up for debate, because simply they are not core, if you will, they are not core to Sirat al-Mustaqim. One of the questions that comes up is, what sources am I using? Am I using particular sources? The issue of sources actually is quite significant. The book that I have open before me could have been any book. It doesn't really matter. This is called Mawsu'at Hayat Muhammad by Dr. Abdul Minam Al-Hifni. The only reason I'm using it is any source that would help me remember the reports. So there's no particular significance to this particular source, other than it's just a convenient, the convenience of having some of the sources that I would like to share, or some of the quotes that I would like to share, some of the hadiths that I would like to share. But the sources of Sirah, there are so many numerous texts. If you want one of the best contemporary sources that has collected in one set the diverse reports from the many sources of Sirah, in fact, perhaps all of them. I haven't noticed that he's left anything out. Is I'm trying to find his name because I'm gonna forget. He is of course, because I'm looking for him now, I can't find him. Oh no, yeah, Ja'far Murtada Al-Amili. He has a book called As-Sahih min Sirat Al-Nabi Al-Azam. It's a 32-volume work. This is a Shi'i source, but I like it because Murtada Al-Amili collects all the competing reports about the various historical events in the life of the Prophet ﷺ from Sunni and Shi'i sources. And he actually does a good job analytically comparing the various reports and raising questions about logical discrepancies in these reports. That doesn't mean, like any other source, that it doesn't mean you agree with everything he says, but I like the fact that he went through the hard work of collecting competing reports and analytically thinking through the logical discrepancies that are raised in the various sources of Sirah. Now, the issue of sources is so important because, as you will see, on a variety of questions, there are numerous competing reports, and the those who reported on Sirah, without a shadow of doubt, some of them circulated reports that intended to support political causes that emerged after the death of the Prophet ﷺ. And it is from the point of view of a historian, it is unquestionable that particular reports are intended to support specific political causes. Among those, perhaps the clearest example of these are the despotism reports, the reports that basically teach Muslims to accept despotism and to accept the injustice of rulers as God's will, which sets in clear tension with the whole trajectory of the prophecy of Muhammad, which was a rebellion against injustice and a rebellion against despotism and a rebellion against oppression. But you will find competing reports even on things like, for example, the age of Khadija, whether Khadija was in her 40s or in her 20s when she married the Prophet ﷺ. You will find competing reports on whether Khadija was ever married before the Prophet. Did she marry twice, as many sources say, and that the Prophet ﷺ was her third husband, or she was never unwed when she actually married the Prophet? We have even competing reports on whether certain individuals were the daughters of the Prophet, like Zainab or Ruqayya, whether these particular figures were Raba'ib al-Rasul, Raba'ib al-Rasul meaning they were raised in his house, but they were not his daughters, or whether they were in fact his daughters. Part of the problem is if you say that they were the daughters of the Prophet, then that would mean that they were married when they were about 10 years old, which is problematic, because if they were born after to the marriage to Khadija, so if they were in fact the daughters of Khadija and Muhammad ﷺ, then that would mean they were married when they were about 10 years old. Now, as we will, and again, this is the whole issue of structuralism comes up. The issue of ages of marriage, anyone that is a student of history would know that marriage to individuals that we would consider children in this day and age was a feature not of Muslim society, but a feature of all societies in the historical time. We see it all over the Near East. We see it in India. We see it in China. We see it in Frankish cultures. And it was extremely widespread. The fact that systems of law, including Sharia, did not come and say, we are creating a new age for marriage like we've done in the modern age, where we set many international treaties say that the age for adulthood is 18, some say 21. That's structural. What is substantive is what were the social consequences of marriage, whether marrying at such young age was actually leading to socially positive results or socially negative results. That's a substantive issue. That's an issue of whether actual harm occurred or actual benefit occurred. there are many reasons that societies, again, not just Muslim, but societies at large, wanted to secure marriages, especially for girls, at a very young age. It was a definition of social networking and social protection. Part of the risk is the fear of being conquered by a superior force, and if conquered, while men might survive or not, a lot of societies, when they conquered, if you read the Torah or the Old Testament, you will see that many of the practices were that if you conquer a people, you simply exterminated all the male population, you executed them. But children and women would be sold in turuq. And part of trying to secure the safety of females was to marry them at a very young age. And we see this again all over the world. And disrupting that institution without producing changes all over the world would have had disastrous consequences. But going back to, so you will find many sources in Islamic history that said, well, Zainab and Ruqayya were not his daughters, they were raba'ib, they were raised. And so, in fact, they were not married at 10 years old, they were married when they were 18 years old or when they were 14 years old, and some say even older. Now, how do we approach questions in which you have so many competing reports? Well, there is a structural approach. The structural approach is to say, well, anything that comes from Bukhari is accurate, and that's the gold standard. That's structural. That's formalistic. Why? Because you are saying, I put my trust in Bukhari's structure. That's why we call it a formalistic approach. I think the formalistic approach is wrong because it's a lazy approach. It basically says whatever work Bukhari did is that's what works for everyone. Well, Bukhari was a human being, and you will find Bukhari himself includes many contradictory reports, even on issues like the age of Khadija. So, for one, Bukhari himself, as a collector of hadith, would often include contradictory reports. And by including contradictory reports, he's basically telling his audience, you're going to have to do the hard work of analyzing what you think is reliable and what you don't think is reliable. A substantive approach is not to put your trust in a formalistic source like Bukhari, but in fact to do the hard work of analyzing why there are variant reports, what were the sources of these variant reports, where they come from. And here is a very important methodological point. My contention, and inshallah what I will try to show, is that everything that Allah wanted us to know for sure, Allah did not leave any doubt about the historical evidence. Everything that was left up for debate, it is because it actually doesn't make a difference in the Islamic message. That it is not a coincidence that Allah left many historical questions up for debate, because simply they are not core if you will, they are not core to Sirat al-Mustaqim. That is not what it's about. While at the same time, everything that is core to Sirat al-Mustaqim, we notice time and time and time again, which was one of the most remarkable things that I've discovered, is there is no historical debate on these issues. That, again, that active divine agent in history, as we did when we studied the Quran, and inshallah we'll see when we study the Sirah, is not a coincidence. And it is profound and life-changing. So, we know that the lineage of the Prophet ﷺ, I mean, forgive me when I mention Arabic names, and this is just for the sake of being comprehensive and accurate. But so, the lineage of the Prophet ﷺ goes back to Ibn Khuzaymah bin Mudrika, who several names until you get to Ibn Adnan. Now, what is the significance of this? Well, there are a couple of things. It is important to realize that so many of the core figures in the life of the Prophet ﷺ were related, even if distant relatives. So, for instance, and I'm just giving some examples, that Ibn Khuzaymah, the great-great-great-great-great-grandfather, who comes from the lineage of Ibn Adnan, and again, just bear with me. Ibn Khuzaymah, among his children was Malik. Malik gave birth to someone called Fihr. Fihr gave birth to someone called Ghalib. Ghalib gave birth to someone called Lu'ay. Lu'ay gave birth to Ka'b. Okay. Now, Ka'b gave birth to several children, who in turn gave birth to several children. Among those children was someone like Umar ibn al-Khattab. So Umar ibn al-Khattab comes from Uday, and Uday comes from Ka'b. Ka'b is the same lineage from which the Prophet ﷺ will descend. But you see, someone like Umar ibn al-Khattab has that family tree that he shares with the Prophet ﷺ. Or Abu Bakr. Abu Bakr is also among the descendants of Uday. Uday among his lineage is a line that goes through Taym, through Sa'd, through Ka'b, and then Ka'b is the father of Abu Bakr. So you will find a lot of the figures. Khadija herself, the Prophet's first wife, is through descendants through the lineage of Abd Uzay. Abd al-Uzay himself a descendant from that same lineage of Ka'b that goes all the way to Ibn Khuzaymah and so on. So there is a qaraba there is a blood relation that connected many of the Qurayshi society, even though they belonged to different clans. Many of these clans descended from the same lineage. Importantly, the recognition of lineage was significant because of the genealogy of prophecy itself. And this is one of the critical points. So, really, the story must begin with the Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam and Ismail alayhi salam, who are ordered. There's a side point, like again, about the contested sources of history. It is commonly said, for instance, that Hagar, Ibrahim's wife, was an Egyptian. That itself is a big question, whether she was indeed an Egyptian or not. But, we don't, it's not important for us to get into. But Ibrahim, as we know the story, takes Hajar, following God's command, and goes to an area, a geographic area, that can rightly be described as out of the realms of history. It is not an exaggeration to say that the area where Ibrahim alayhi salam settles Hajar and his son Ismail is outside the mainstream of history. This is actually quite significant and quite important. It is, again, not a coincidence that when the Jewish tribes are oppressed by the Romans, and many of them escape, they flee Palestine, they run away from Palestine, they end up settling in different parts in Arabia, different tribes like Khaybar or like Yathrib. And although this happens again centuries after Ibrahim and Ismail had settled in Mecca, or what becomes Mecca, the Jewish tribes that had settled in Yathrib had eventually come to control the economy of Yathrib, which will become Al-Medina. And most of the Arab tribes, because of their tribal feuds that have exhausted themselves in long feuds and long wars, had become basically dependent in their employment. So many of the Aus and Khazraj, who are tribes that settled the area of Yathrib, Arab tribes, have become hired workers for the Jewish tribes of Yathrib. Okay. Now, we don't need to get into the long story of what happens after Ibrahim leaves Hajar and Ismail, except just to say in general that among the inherited mythology, if you will, of this region is that what was essential for the settlement of this area was a spring of water at the time that goes all the way back to Ismail. The spring of water known as Zamzam, eventually through several descendants, there is a tribe called the tribe of Jurhum. Jurhum controls this area in Mecca. Eventually, a different tribe defeats or overwhelms, disempowers Jurhum, the tribe of Khuza'ah. And Khuza'ah itself is said to have buried the spring of Zamzam, and the location of Zamzam becomes a myth, a mythology, and it's lost because it will take a long time until Zamzam is rediscovered again. And eventually, from Khuza'ah, the tribe that becomes in charge, and the lineage of Ibn Khuzaymah here is important, is the tribe of Quraysh. So why am I mentioning all of this? Why am I mentioning from Jurhum to Khuza'ah to the tribe of Quraysh? Because in all of these dynamics that are at the margins of history, there is a constant mythology that sustains the people of Mecca. And that mythology is that we collectively are the descendants of Ibrahim alayhi salam and the descendants of Ismail. And although the introduction of Asnam, the introduction of idols, the introduction of idols had been imported from Sham, from the area of Sham, Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, and some from Iraq, some from Yemen. And although the idols had been, because of the importation, and idols was again structurally a very common symbolism of worship. So although much of this has been imported in Mecca, and significantly, the reason that many of the idols that have been imported from Yemen and Iraq and Sham were imported for financial reasons. It made good business. But it sat at tension with and at odds with the founding mythology of Mecca itself. The founding mythology was monotheism. That we worship, that our great-great-great-great-great-grandfather Ibrahim and Ismail worship one God, and that Allah is this God, but we cannot afford to do away with the idols because it would be costly. We have travelers that come from Yemen, from Iraq, from Sham, and all these travelers spend a great deal of money at the feet of these idols, who are seen as interceders. The idols themselves are representatives of symbolic deities, whether they're deities inferior to Allah or equal to Allah, or that's a very big topic. There is a 12-volume set. I forgot the name of the author, but it's about the life of Arabs before Islam, that goes into great detail about each idol and what the system of belief was for each idol and where the idol came from. I mean, it's very fascinating, but it's not necessary for us. But the core thing is that it had become a financial institution. At the same time, Mecca itself never entirely got rid of what became known as the Hunafa, those who rejected the idols because they were inconsistent with the founding mythology of Mecca. Now, this is of significance in light of the fact that Jewish tribes had escaped oppression and settled in different parts of Arabia. Because what Jewish tribes consistently communicated to the Arabs is that we are the people of monotheism. And often their attitude towards Arabs is that you are uncivilized, barbaric, and your monotheism is not authentic. The irony is there is a lot of archaeological evidence that at the same time that Jewish tribes had sort of dealt with their own monotheism as an ethnic, racial phenomenon. In other words, monotheism is only good for Jews, but you Arabs are not to share with us our monotheism. There is very interesting archaeological evidence that the Jewish tribes actually had idol worship in their midst, that they actually never got rid of idols themselves. But nevertheless, we have plenty of evidence that this whole... now, at the same time, there is a present mythology that the Jews of Arabia are waiting the arrival of a Messiah. Now, evidence of this mythology, interestingly, although it's many Muslim sources tell us that that was the case, but evidence of this mythology, interestingly, is found in non-Muslim sources. So, for example, this is a quote from a non-Muslim source that was written at the time of the appearance of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. So let me find this quote. Okay, yeah. So, this is this is, I'm reading from a book called White and Earth by a German scholar, Aaron van Altenburg. But he himself is quoting from other sources. So anyway, so here's the quote, for instance. It says, "When I was in Caesarea, I took a boat to Shicomona, a town near the sea of the coast of Haifa, Palestine, and came across people who said that the Byzantine royal guard had been killed. We here refers as Jews, we Jews rejoiced at this news. They also announced that the prophet had appeared. He had come to the Arabs and announced the appearance of the Messiah. Then I, Abraham, went to an old man who was very familiar with the Holy Scriptures and drew his attention to the matter. I asked him, 'What do you think, master and teacher, about the prophet who appeared to the Arabs?' 'He is an impostor,' he replied. 'Come prophets with swords and chariots, these are truly acts of chaos which started today. I fear that the Christ who once came when the Christians worship, whom the Christians worship, has been sent by God. Instead, we will accept Harmolius. Harmolius was a priest who was executed by the Roman Emperor Maximilian. Instead, we will accept Harmolius, he added, for Isaiah said that we Jews have a flawed and hardened heart until the whole earth becomes desolate. But go, Mr. Abraham, and inquire about the prophet who appeared. And so I made inquiries, and those I met told me there is no truth to be found in the so-called prophet, only bloodshed. What the people he met say about his supposed possession of the key to heaven is unbelievable. So, obviously, this is a Jewish source that is saying there are rumors that the awaited prophet has appeared. But then he rejects that prophet and says, but this is an imposter. And which will become a common theme among the enemies of Islam is, oh, this is the prophet of blood, that this man sheds bloodshed. So now, of course, the irony is that many of the prophets of Israel were leaders of war. So, but that is, anyway. So we know from material culture that this theme of that something is going to happen, an awaited Messiah is to come, and something that were raised by the Jewish tribes, but the Jewish tribes always raised it on the assumption that the awaited Messiah, that prophet to come or that Messiah to come after Moses and after Jesus will necessarily be an Israelite, be a descendant from the lineage of Ishaq, Isaac, not the lineage of Ismail. Importantly, Arabs themselves, by the time of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, there is ample evidence that Arabs themselves had come to accept this as true through the influence of Jewish tribes, that the awaited prophet will be an Israelite. Although the Israelites would often say, when our prophet would come, we will conquer you, and basically we will dominate you and be in charge. So, this is interestingly one of the there are reports that I find very interesting that Khadija, after she goes into business, and we'll elaborate upon this point a bit later, but goes into business with the Prophet. This is before they married. And he goes on a business trip to Al-Sham. So upon coming back from this trip, and she hears from her employer about, and I will elaborate upon this later, but she hears about the conduct of the Prophet ﷺ in this trip. There are fascinating reports that she suspects that he might be the awaited prophet, and that when she marries him, she is hoping that this in fact be the case. Now, it's interesting because there is ample evidence that while this man and we'll elaborate upon this point, I'm just laying the grounds now, was in fact interacting with the society that he existed in. He always stood out as someone unique and special. Many of the reports in which he supposedly or reportedly is seen by a monk or seen by a Jewish scholar, and then they say, "Oh, this is the awaited prophet." I don't necessarily count these reports in and of themselves as reliable, but there is cumulative evidence that he was repeatedly seen as something unique and we'll talk about his morality and his character and what was unique about that. And so someone that is not like the others who've rejected the idols of Mecca and insisted on a monotheism or on honoring the teachings of Ibrahim, that his morality, his character, even exceeded his fellow Hunafa, or those who rejected the materialist culture of Mecca and the system of caving in to idol worship. If Islam would have emerged anywhere else in the Near East, it would have emerged under the reality of an existing imperial power. But here's the thing. The Arab character had the right combination of freedom and liberty and sense of individual dignity to be the agents of creativity and invention. This is why we'll get there, but the narrative of when he gets a little bit of money later on in Medina, it was a gift, and he can't sleep. And when his wife asks him, "Why can't you sleep?" and he says, I'm bothered. There's money in the house. Please give it away as sadaqah. In other words, cleanse me of this, because he understood what this message was about.